Hi, welcome to the fifth lecture in the series on the question of how Islam became political. My name is Leslie Terebesi. Before we proceed to the fifth or the second last stage of this process of the politicization of Islam, let us review or recap the first four stages as we have covered them in the previous videos. You will remember that our inquiry began with the question, how did the religion of peace become transformed into something politicized, something that we have referred to as political Islam? And recall that the first stage in this process was what we have called or referred to as the repression of reason. Now, this repression of reason, you will recall, took place within the context of the squabbles between the so-called traditionists and the rationalists. The traditionists needed a good argument, so to speak, against the rationalists, and the best argument they could come up with, it seems, was the view or the perception that actually the use of reason in talking about the religion, and more specifically the use of reason to interpret religion, was something that was prohibited. And in order to back up this claim, it appears that the traditionists came up with a tradition allegedly attributed to the Prophet himself, according to which the Prophet said, or was reported to have said, that anyone who uses his reason to understand or interpret Revelation or the Quran is actually committing an act of disbelief or kufr. So that was the first stage in this process of the politicization of Islam. From this prohibition resulted what we have referred to as a reduction in the use of reason in matters relating to religion. And as a result of this reduced reliance on reason, or as a result of this shying away from the use of reason to understand and explain revelation, exegetes began to encounter passages in the Quran that struck them as first ambiguous and secondly as contradictory. Now, in order to deal with the first challenge, they have basically made recourse to the hadiths or the ahadiths, or what are known also as the prophetic traditions. And in order to deal with the second problem, that of the verses that appear to them as contradictory, they made recourse to a new doctrine, and this was the doctrine of abrogation. So, but before they could use the traditions, the prophetic traditions, to explain the ambiguous parts of the revelation, they felt obliged to elevate tradition to the rank of revelation on account of three verses in chapter 5, Surah Al-Ma'idah, verses 44, 45, and 47, which state that anyone who who judges by something that Allah has not revealed is a zalim, a kafir, and a fasik. In English, that means a wrongdoer, a disbeliever, and a rebel. So, in order for the exegetes to be able to call on tradition to explain revelation, or what appeared to them as ambiguous parts of revelation, they pretty much felt obliged to elevate tradition to the rank of revelation. And this is what actually happened in the second stage. The second stage consisted of the equality, or of asserting the equality of tradition with the revelation of the Quran. Now, the third stage, you will recall, was a further elevation of tradition, this time to the rank of a judge of revelation, and this was the stage at which actually the exegetes began to use tradition to explain, quote unquote, the ambiguous parts of the revelation. So that was the third stage. The fourth stage, you will recall, went a step further, and in this fourth stage, the tradition did not only explain a revelation, it did not only judge a revelation, but even ended up abrogating parts of the revelation. So this was facilitated, or rather enabled by the adoption and the application of the so-called doctrine of abrogation. So now in this fourth stage, the stage in which the doctrine of abrogation was applied, consisted of actually three distinct types of abrogation, speaking broadly. And that was the abrogation of the Quran by the Quran, the abrogation of the Quran by tradition, and also the abrogation of the previous revelations by the last revelation, the revelation of the Quran. So that was the fourth stage out of the six stages that we are looking at in this series of lectures. Today, in the remainder of the time in this particular video, I will talk about the fifth stage, which is the second last stage in this entire process of the transformation of the religion of peace into political Islam. And this stage may be described as the stage in which the rulings based on revelation or rulings based on the Quran were replaced by rulings based on tradition. So this was actually another major step in the process of the elevation of tradition, and actually it produced anomalies and problems in the Sharia, and in particular within Islamic law. Let me just give you a couple of examples. One example of the abrogation of a ruling found in Revelation was the adoption of the death penalty by stoning for the crime of adultery. Now, the Quran does recognize unlawful sexual intercourse or adultery as a crime. However, the punishment prescribed in the Quran is 100 lashes after four reliable witnesses testifying that this crime had actually taken place. However, it appears that the jurists went back to a few traditions rather than follow the revealed ruling on adultery. And in these traditions, the prescribed penalty for adultery is actually different from that prescribed in the Quran. This penalty prescribed in the traditions, or described rather, I should say, in the traditions, is actually a harsher penalty and is none other than the death by stoning for the people that have committed adultery and were convicted of doing so on the basis of four reliable witnesses, or in some cases on the basis of confessions. So now this was very problematic because it represented, not only because it represented a clear departure from the ruling specified in the Quran, which was 100, which is 100 lashes, but also this ruling, or this replacement of the ruling in the Quran on the issue of adultery, is also problematic because it represents the replacement of a ruling decreed by Allah or God by a ruling drawn from man-made traditions, which means that in fact this ruling in the Quran, which we take to be a divine ruling, was in effect both abrogated and replaced by rulings drawn from human sources, in other words from the traditions. So now this appears to be a clear case of a lapse into polytheism of sorts, because the divine authority of God was permitted to be overruled, or was overruled, so to speak, by the authority of mere human beings, and that is not supposed to happen according to the teaching of the Quran. The other example I would like to give is the death penalty for apostasy. Now, the Quran identifies apostasy as an offense, but it stops short of identifying it as a crime, meaning that there is no punishment specified for this offense of apostasy in this life. However, punishment is promised for those who commit apostasy in the hereafter. In other words, the Quran treats apostasy as a sin but not as a crime. However, it seems that some exegetes and jurists had a different opinion on this matter and decided to treat apostasy as a crime rather than as a mere sin. Now, as a crime, apostasy would be punishable not only in the hereafter, as specified in the Quran, but also in this life, and this is indeed what the exegetes and jurists declared. They declared, on the basis of a tradition attributed to the Prophet, that the proper punishment for apostasy is the death penalty. Now, this punishment of death penalty for apostasy, ironically, was based on a solitary tradition, solitary hadith, so to speak, which was related by someone called Ikrima on the basis of a report made by one of the companions of the Prophet by the name of Ibn Abbas. And In other words, this was the penalty of death for apostasy was based on a solitary narration. And what is troubling about this particular penalty, additionally, is the fact that when Ibn Abbas allegedly heard the Prophet say this, he was only 13 years old. Normally, two witnesses are required for any kind of, in mainstream Islam, that is to say, for any kind of punishment to be incorporated into the Sharia or into the penal law. But in this case, the punishment for apostasy was incorporated on the basis of a solitary report by a 13-year-old. Moreover, this particular hadith is exposed to additional problems because it says, when rendered literally, that the Prophet allegedly said, and by the way, no one else heard him say this, as was implied by the fact that this is a solitary tradition. Another problem to which this tradition is exposed to is that if taken literally, this tradition would require all the converts to be killed also because they all changed their religion. And the reason is that the hadith states that the Prophet allegedly said that anyone who changes his religion should be killed. So that, of course, includes also all the converts. Additional problems with this hadith include the fact that it runs counter to the Quranic injunction that there be no compulsion in religion. It also runs counter to a verse in Surah An-Nisa, verse 137, which refers to apostasy, where the Quran says those who believe and then disbelieve and then believe again and then disbelieve again and then keep on adding to their disbelief, Allah will not forgive them. Now, this particular verse mentions apostasy twice, but there's no mention of any kind of punishment for this apostasy in that verse or anywhere near that verse, or in fact anywhere in the Quran for that matter. So, for these reasons, the implementation of the death penalty for apostasy as well for adultery, both of these replacements, as it were, of divine rulings by rulings based on traditions are problematic and need to be reconsidered, and I believe they need to be set aside. So this was the fifth stage in the process of the politicization of Islam, where the rulings of the Quran were essentially replaced by rulings based on human reports or traditions, as we call them. So this brings me to a conclusion of this particular lecture, and I will end by stating that in the next and last lecture in this series, we are going to be talking about how in the last stage of this process, the religion of peace was essentially transformed into a kind of into a political political Islam, uh, which was reflected in the adoption primarily of the doctrine of the so-called war between the abode of peace and the abode of war, known as the conflict between the Darul Islam and the Darul Harb. Thank you very much.